Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and I am going to resume the wonderful book, Internal Family Systems Therapy for Shame and Guilt by Martha Sweezy. And I'm going to share a vignette with you today of one of Martha's clients named Darby, who is blended with an angry part that doesn't trust Martha, doesn't trust the therapy process. And so it's a fascinating example of how Martha handles that. She calls it an angry firefighter part who is trying to contain a drug-using firefighter part. And she says at the start, firefighter parts aim to bring relief from pain, and they usually have plenty of options. They also pinch hit for each other. The last option, which is death, is ironically what even very destructive firefighters are trying to prevent. So that's why in some traditional models where we're trying to manage and control what seems like problematic parts, right? Like addiction, self-harming parts, risk-taking, raging parts, or any kind of numbing, binging part. If we get that one to go away, the next in line is a suicidal part. And so that's why it can be problematic, right, to do that and not understand the good intention that these parts have, that they're really trying to prevent that by numbing the painful ones that they protect. All right, so Darby's firefighter parts disagree. Darby, a 38-year-old cisgender heterosexual Icelandic American partnered male veteran of the American war in Afghanistan, had recently relapsed on fentanyl and had just been in an intensive outpatient treatment program. As he segued out of that program, he started individual psychotherapy. So Darby's angry firefighter comes into therapy and says to Martha, let's get a few things straight from the start. I don't expect you to like me or my politics. Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organization that was created by looters and criminals. I hate towel heads with machine guns, and I voted for Donald Trump. So can we just leave all that on the side? So she makes a note, Martha makes a note, that Darby's white supremacist part is taking the lead. And really coming out full force, probably expecting Martha to resist. And so he says, can we leave all that on the side? Martha says, probably not. Do you want to hear why? And Darby's angry firefighter says, because you're liberal. And Martha says, I do have opinions about Donald Trump. I will keep my parts out of your business. But we can't do this without including your parts. So Martha makes another side note. It says, I am aware that Darby is speaking from a part, but I don't say that to him yet. I use implicit direct access. That is, I speak to his blended part without saying, you are a part. However, I do take the opportunity to introduce parts language, right? So she's aware that this kind of white supremacist extremist part is blended with Darby in this moment, and that it's a part of him. She doesn't say that directly, but she does explain that we're going to have to talk about these things because it is part of your parts, and that's what I'm all about, is talking about your parts. So then Darby says, what does that mean? Right? He's not maybe familiar with parts language. So Martha says, as far as I'm concerned, we're all the same in the most essential ways. Our minds have subpersonalities, which I call parts. For example, today you started off speaking from an angry part. It seems to be angry because it expects me to judge you. So rather then responding and coming against, resisting, focusing on the differences that clearly it seems like Martha and this client Darby have, Martha focuses on what they have in common, that we all have these multiple parts. And what I noticed is that you were blended with this kind of angry part out of the gate. And she gets curious about the motive. She says, I have this hunch. I wonder if it's because there's an expectation that I'm going to judge you, right? Whenever we feel it's like a preemptive strike, right? We feel like the other person's going to judge us, we get defensive. And it sounds like this part is doing that. So you can kind of sense the disarming nature of her response. This is what we have in common. I noticed this. Is this true? And Darby says, okay. And Martha says, so your angry part came here on the offensive. So I was saying they're defensive, but defending his point of view, but being offensive, right? On the offensive, really, with it. Darby says, yeah. And Martha says, does this part often chime in on politics? Darby says, yes. And Martha says, would you be interested in getting to know it better? Darby says, okay. And Martha says, before we do that, how do you feel toward it? This part that chimes in on politics. And Darby says, I like it. Martha makes a note that the part seems to remain blended. And so she knows that she's speaking with it, but still hasn't made that explicit. So she says, what is the most important thing that it does for you? Darby says, it keeps me alive. And Martha says, yes, angry parts do that. Is it listening to us now? So she's continuing to try to create this unblending, this separation between Darby's self that can recognize the angry part, because he's really been blended with it most of the time, thinks it is him, right? And I love how she says, in her tone, well, I'm inferring her tone, but has this appreciation for the part. And I really relate to that. I have such appreciation for people's angry parts because I know that they are loyal to them and they are protecting certain needs, certain vulnerabilities. And so when I see angry parts, especially when they're not directed at me, it's very clear, ooh, angry part, loyal part, it's protecting something vulnerable. I wonder what it is. And since Darby's part has been expecting criticism and judgment, it's very disarming, right? So let me see. What did Martha just say? Oh, yeah. Yes, angry parts do that. Is it listening to us? And Darby says warily, maybe. And Martha says, can you see it? And he says, yeah. And so Martha says, can we be curious about it? But then Darby shows irritability and says, I don't have to be curious about it. I know it. So again, maybe still blended with this part. And Martha says, because you are the angry part, you keep Darby alive. So now, I mean, she's talking directly to the angry part and being pretty explicit that she's doing that now. So she says, I see the part won't unblend, so I switch to explicit direct access. And Darby's angry part says, yeah, you keep him alive. And Martha says, when did you start protecting him? And the angry firefighter says, a long time ago. Martha says, what would happen if you stopped? And the firefighter says, I won't. Martha says, I have no idea what Darby was thinking about during, she says there was a long pause before you said, I won't. And she had no idea what he was thinking about during that pause. But she says, I assume that he wouldn't tell me at this point if I asked, so I don't ask. Yeah. Again, as the therapist or as the self in the room, you really have to gain trust, and the self knows that, right? So first coming in with non-judgmental curiosity. And then you can see here that Martha is basically doing the insight process from herself to this part by saying, how long have you been doing this job? What would happen if you stopped? That kind of thing. So what Martha says is, okay, here's what I understand so far. So she's going to give a review. It's very important for you to stay on the job, and you don't approve of Darby coming to therapy, but you do let him come anyway. Why? And the angry firefighter says, because he's using again. I imagine fentanyl. He's using fentanyl. So Martha says, and what is your concern about that? And the angry firefighter says, I'm the one who keeps him alive. Martha says, it could kill him. Okay, here's what I propose, and it's completely up to you if we proceed this way or not. I propose that Darby, his using part, and you, his angry part, all get together to talk. And the angry part said, who's Darby? And Martha says, you tell me. So she's trying to see if the angry part knows Darby's self that's not a part, or what they think of that. And the angry part says, he's a guy who can't control himself. Okay, so that's a clear statement that what the angry part sees as Darby is probably the using part, right? That he's polarized with. So Martha says, that is the using part. I'm talking about Darby, who is not a part. Since the using part is doing a job just like you, and it won't stop until that job becomes unnecessary, I want you to meet with him and the using part. You see, we need to find out what the using part is worried about and who it protects. And the angry firefighter says, okay. So Martha's self is really kind of making an alliance with the angry part here, is saying, I get it. This part could kill him and it could kill Darby, and I get your concern. But we have to be able to befriend this part. We have to get to know it to understand why it's doing this and what it's protecting. And then what we both want might be able to come from that, which is that the using part would be able to relax and not put Darby in danger anymore. So ultimately, she and the angry part have the same goal, to keep Darby alive. And so she's proposing a different method that might be more effective. And it seems like the angry part is on board. So she's finding common ground. And then her final note is, in this example, an angry firefighter is polarized with a drug-using firefighter. The angry one, who expected me to shame him, went on the offensive immediately. I did not take the bait, nor did I agree to leave all that on the side as the part demanded. Instead, I kept the session in flow by asking the angry part what it wanted. Why did it allow the client to come into therapy? And by pointing out that if we plan to influence the using part's behavior, we needed to understand its motives. All right. So this is a great example. If you watch the last video I made, a little training on self-like parts. As a therapist, right, it is really easy for Martha, if someone comes into the office blended with an angry part that's on the offense directly toward her, to blend with her own parts that get defensive, or at least agitated and overwhelmed. So she had to really likely inside herself be tending to her own parts there so that she could stay in self and understand this is a part of her client, not all of him, and that it has a role, it has a reason it's doing this, and can I get curious about it? And that, as you can see, was very effective. So the most effective thing as an IFS practitioner that you or I, any of us can do, is to tend to our own parts so that we can show up in self, even with really intimidating protectors in our clients. We can get curious about them. You know, and then when you understand that it's bringing him in because it wants him to stay alive and is in polarization with the using part, you begin to have some compassion, right, on it. And I love how Martha just found common ground with that part. So if you have any questions or comments about this example, please leave them in the comments below.